The story of Lycurgus and the birth of Spartan society. In the centuries following the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization, about 1100 BC, Greece entered what is often referred to as the Dark Ages. During this time, many communities struggled to find stability, but one place, Sparta, began to rise as a unique and powerful force in the Greek world. According to tradition, this transformation was led by the legendary lawgiver named Lycurgus. Lycurgus was a royal prince of Sparta who lived sometime between the 9th and 8th centuries BC. According to Spartan legend, after the death of his brother, the king, Lycurgus, was poised to rule. However, when his brother's widow gave birth to a son, Lycurgus stepped aside to allow the child to inherit the throne, dedicating himself to something far greater, reshaping Spartan society. The Sparta of Lycurgus' time was plagued by inequality, internal strife, and a weak governance. Seeing this, Lycurgus embarked on a journey across Greece, visiting Crete, Ionia, and possibly even Egypt, gathering wisdom and ideas to reform his homeland. Upon his return, he claimed that the Oracle of Delphi had blessed his mission to create a new social order for Sparta. Lycurgus implemented radical reforms that touched every aspect of Spartan life. He redistributed land to ensure all citizens had an equal share, eliminating the vast disparities that had bred discontent. He established a communal system of education and training for boys that would turn Spartan men into the most disciplined and feared warriors in Greece. To strengthen the Spartan military state, he instituted the practice of communal dining halls where every citizen ate together, fostering equality and camaraderie. He also forbade the accumulation of gold and silver, replacing it with iron currency to discourage wealth accumulation and corruption. Lycurgus' reforms were so profound that they shaped Spartan society for centuries. He was said to have promised the people that he would not change any of those laws until he returned from consulting the gods once more. Then he mysteriously left Sparta, never to return, ensuring that his reforms would remain in place, unaltered forever. The story of Lycurgus and the birth of Spartan society presents a vivid image of a city-state forged from chaos into order. It offers a glimpse into the values of equality, discipline, and duty that would make Sparta legendary in the ancient world. This story should, in many ways, set the tone for our understanding of the beginning of the Greek city-states and how they begin to shift and change the known Greek world. Hi, I'm Dr. David Santos. We're continuing our study in ancient Mediterranean history. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the rise of the Greek city-states. We opened up by looking at the account of the establishment of the city-state of Sparta. It's one of those accounts that somewhat has a mythological feel to it, but it's an important beginning to our understanding of what the Greek city-states were like. And it starts to help us to understand really what how the Greeks thought about their own identity, how they developed these city-states. And what we see is each of the key city-states that we're going to look at is very unique. It has its own identity, and the inhabitants see themselves as, say, Spartans or Athenians. So they have a communal identity. But as we go through, eventually we're going to get to the point where they also have a broader communal identity as Greek. So even though the city-states have issues with one another, they're still going to see themselves all as Greek. So just mention here the rise of the Greek city-state. So the word is polis that they use, and it began to develop during the Greek Dark Ages. So these start out in that Dark Age in 1100 to 800 BC. By the Archaic period, so by the time you hit 800 BC on through 500 when they start to go away, they become the way that many Greeks live. They're the prominent idea within Greek life. So the rise of these city-states is linked to the recovery of population, economic activity. So when we say economic activity, populations come up, so their trade begins. So there's interaction between these city-states and eventually beyond the city-states as well. So trade with foreign, non-Greek entities is what we're talking about. This development, of course, is after the Mycenaean civilization, and they also established these new social structures, which is really one of the key focuses for us in this study. So the first one we want to look at, Athens. So when people mention ancient Greece, oftentimes this is what comes to their mind, and this is what comes to their mind because so much emphasis has been placed on Athenian culture, Athenian architecture, along with the Corinthian architecture, but really these white stone pillars, the Parthenon, just all these structural all the structures there that people think of when you say Greece. That's Athens. Now understand, historically, while we praise Athens, and we especially think about the philosophers and things that came out of that, but there were more than just Athens when we talk about the Greek city-states. Although that is the big one for many people. So it's established. Athens is the location was continuously inhabited since the Mycenaean period, so 1600 to 11. So there have been people there. They're just not living in city-states yet. So it became a significant city-state during the Archaic period, so 8th century BC, or 7th century, somewhere in there. So the significance, political and cultural center. Athens is renowned for its early development of democracy, particularly during the 6th century BC under the reforms of Solon and later Cleisthenes. It also became the center of philosophy, art, and literature. So classical period influence. So it's during the classical period, which is the 5th century BC, Athens experienced its golden age, and that's what most people hearken back to, is this Athenian golden age. They had great leadership at times, like, for example, Pericles, who we'll talk about later. So it produced influential philosophers, of course, like Socrates and Plato, Aristotle. So these important figures that we're still reading about them, still learning more about them, and understanding what they brought, that gets brought into Western culture. So important people. So the role of Persians in Peloponnesian War. So that's what we're going to flesh out more in a future lecture. But Athens led this league, this coalition, the Delian League, against the Persian Empire. And they fought against Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars, which marked its decline in power. So In a future lecture, we're going to look at the Peloponnesian Wars and the Persian Wars separately in future lectures where those are the focus. But one of your questions is going to be, who wins the Peloponnesian War? So it'll be something for you to be considering. So Sparta, so its establishment. The Spartan state emerged around the 10th century BC. It became fully developed city-state in the 8th century BC. So its significance. So first point, military oligarchy. Sparta was known for its unique social system and emphasis on military discipline. The Spartan constitution, attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, established a rigid oligarchy that prioritized military prowess. So lest you think that from the opening description of the establishment of Sparta that they were establishing a communistic commune, that's not what they were doing. They established an oligarchy, and this is a military system. So the idea of Sparta is to establish discipline. The way they raised children was to raise soldiers, and boys are taken into that system very early. So very unique system. We'll get deeper into them, especially once we move into the next lectures. Their role in the Persian police and the Peloponnesian Wars. So Sparta led the Peloponnesian League and was a key force in the defeat of the Persians. So they're crucial to that war. Like I said, we have lectures dedicated specifically to that. In that war, what we're going to see, one of the things that we'll see is this new, very specific Greek identity arise, primarily out of that war, and the Olympics help with that as well, especially as they're doing certain activities in the Olympics that harken back and memorialize certain battles and things. So it also defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War, becoming the dominant power in Greece until it was later challenged by Thebes and Macedon. So a little hint for one of your future questions there. Corinth, it's established. Corinth was one of the wealthiest city-states located on the Isthmus of Corinth. It's established during the early Archaic period, but it also has these Mycenaean roots. So its significance, its trade and colonization. So due to its strategic location between the Aegean and the Ionian Seas, Corinth became a major center for trade and colonization. So it's essentially in the middle of a trade route. So lots of people are stopping in there, doing business. So it becomes an important economic center. It founded important colonies such as Syracuse, which is in Sicily, and Corfu. So the role of Greek politics. So Corinth plays a significant role in the Greek alliances, siding with Sparta during the Peloponnesian Wars. It remained an important cultural and economic hub throughout the classical and Hellenistic periods. So it establishes itself as this economic center. So as people are stopping in there, what happens as foreigners start to use this as a hub for economic trade? Well, they bring their cultures with them, wherever they come from, they bring it with them. And as the city-state grows, becomes a more popular destination, more foreigners come in, and they start to establish their own, say, religious temples, their own cultural centers. So all that stuff comes in, and it probably tells us a lot about what we see when we get to the New Testament period and we start to read Pauline letters, and we read the first and second letters to Corinthians, and we see all of this mishmash of cultural backgrounds and that are really seeping into the early church. And a lot of it has to do with religious practices. And we know Paul, for example, wrote to the Corinthians about the stronger brother, the weaker brother, specifically in relationship to the eating of meat. And when he's talking about that, he's talking about going to a pagan temple and purchasing meat, and that meat would have originated from a sacrificial system in a pagan temple. And Paul says, if you can handle it, it's fine. And it was probably some of the highest quality meat. But if you can't, if it disrupts your conscience, you should stay away from it. And if you're with someone, it disrupts their conscience, you should stay away from it as well, not so that you're not a stumbling block to them. It's a good idea, caring for your brothers and sisters in Christ. But also you have the sort of a proto-Christian feminism seeking into the church at Corinth. And that proto-Christian feminism originates in these pagan temples. A whole bunch of it comes from one of the pagan temples was a huge one that was dedicated to Isis, and they sort of overlapped and synchronized a number of other goddesses within these temples, but it's primarily Isis, and it's the shaving of the head. There's other temples that actively promoted religious temple prostitution within these things. So it's that we can do what we want kind of idea. So there's other things going on there as well, but you can see Corinth as the prototype for what happens when you allow all these other foreign gods to be your neighbors, and it will eventually seep into your society. So Thebes, so its establishment, Thebes was a major city-state in Boeotia, and it has roots tracing back to the Mycenaean period as well. It rose to prominence during the 6th and 5th centuries BC. So its significance, 2 points. Opposition to Athens and Sparta. Thebes often opposed both of them and eventually rose to power after defeating Sparta in the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC under the leadership of Epaminondas. And cultural contributions, Thebes was also known for its connections to mythological tales, such as stories of Oedipus and Heracles. So we're not going to look at those in this lecture, but we have a spot dedicated for looking at some of these mythological tales. So Argos, its establishment was during the Mycenaean period and continued to develop during the Archaic period. Its significance, again, it's a rival with Sparta, and Argos was one of the main rivals of Sparta for dominance in the Peloponnese. It managed to maintain its independence and often allied with other city-states against Spartan hegemony. So its cultural role is Argos contributed to the arts and sculpture. It's associated with several important Greek myths. So you may have heard, like Jason the Argonauts. Well, this is where that's coming from. So we'll look at those. So Miletu or Miletus, its establishment. It was Miletus was an ancient city of Ionia. It's established during the early Archaic period. It has roots dating back to the Mycenaean period, and its significance is it's an intellectual hub. Miletus was a major intellectual center, giving rise to several pre-Socratic philosophers. So they sort of lay the foundation for natural philosophy. And we see that those ideas of natural philosophy even work their way into the Enlightenment period, what brings about Western civilization in the way that we know it. The Renaissance and Reformation kind of go hand in hand when you get into early modern European philosophy. It's really those ideas from Greek culture and the Judeo-Christian traditions come in and get blended together, at least the good parts of things like natural history. They get blended together and made into Western civilization. Without those things as well, we probably do not have the United States of America as we know it. There's lots of things that this early philosophy feeds into that's still important to us today. We can look at culture today and go, I wonder how we got here. Part of it is a loss of this of these intellectual ideas that were so important to us a couple centuries ago. But here's where it's founded. And notice as we're going through these that there are very clear cultural differences from one city-state to the next. There's some overlap. For example, Miletus has a lot of overlap with Athens. So especially when we look at these intellectual ideas. But this is the foundation for that. So another, Syracuse, it's founded as a colony. So its establishment is unique. It was founded by Corinthian colonists in 734 BC on the island of Sicily. Its significance, it's the power in the West. Syracuse grew to be one of the most powerful Greek cities in the Western Mediterranean. It played a major role in resisting the Carthaginians, who were expanding, and later the Athenian expedition during the Peloponnesian War. So its cultural contributions, it became a major cultural and intellectual center and home of important figures like Archimedes. So I'm sure you've heard his name. So here's a quick map so you can get an idea where some of these guys are. You can see Sparta here in the south. Argos is kind of right in between Sparta and Corinth. Athens is over here. Kind of laugh. If you've ever played Rome Total War, you probably have a pretty good understanding of the geography. This is like my kids used to love that game. Pretty older game now, but did deal with a lot of geography, and that's probably how they sold us on allowing that particular game in the household. So, significance of Greek city-states. The rise of the polis. So the Greek city-state emerges as independent political entities after the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. By the 8th century BC, these city-states began to flourish, making the beginning of the Archaic period. So what we're saying is the rise of the Greek city-states helped the region move from the dark period where all these things were lost because of some sort of collapse, societal collapse. It helps them move into the next stage, to move to the Archaic period, and then they move into their more golden years. So this is a stage in their development that's really important. So distinct political systems. So each city-state developed its own form of government. Athens with its democracy, Sparta with its military oligarchy, Corinth with its aristocracy, demonstrating the diversity of political experimentation in ancient Greece. So that's an important one. And it's also one that the development of Western Civ looks at, and they're able to look at all kinds of different governmental experiments and helps them make decisions on how then modern governments should be developed. So its cultural and intellectual development. Athens, in particular, became the cultural and intellectual hub of Greece. So, and it fosters these philosophies and drama and art and democracy, all these things that we can look back and see how important those ideas still are today. And other city-states like Miletus and Syracuse also contributed significantly to Greek intellectual life. So, wars and alliances. So these city-states often formed alliances such as the Delian League and the Peloponnesian Leagues, leading to conflicts like the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. So the alliances and rivalries shaped the political landscape of ancient Greece. So, and it was always shifting because while they eventually come to the conclusion that they're all Greek, they still have those very clear city-state identities. So there's conflict between the two, not just the two, between all of these as well. So the role of colonization. So many city-states, especially Corinth and Miletus, established colonies throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, spreading Greek culture and influence. So we've talked about the arguments of Mediterranean culture, and I think we conclude that there is no designated Mediterranean culture, and we can see that because think about it, the Near East portion versus Greek portion versus, say, the Carthaginians, they're all very different. But here, the Greek influence is going to go out, and the entire Med is going to start to look a little bit more Greek. Later, the Persian influence is going to be really significant. And, for example, the Greeks are going to start to look and act more Persian. So, and some that go too far, they're going to be accused of being filio barbaros, which is lover of barbarians. So when the culture goes too far, there's this certain level of Greek shaming that pulls them back into Greek society. So the conclusion for this section is by the Hellenistic and Roman periods, so 4th century BC onward, the independent power of the Greek city-state waned as they were absorbed into larger empires. However, they contributed to serve as important cultural and intellectual centers well into the Roman Empire in late antiquity, preserving and transmitting Greek heritage. So even within the Roman world, who implemented the Pax Romana, for example, the Peace of Rome, which is really Peace of Rome by the sword, very Mohammedan of them, but that comes later. You still will see Greek cultural centers. Alexandria, for example, is one where there's a tremendous population in the Roman period of Greeks in Alexandria, Egypt. There's also a lot of Jews in that neighborhood. So there's always conflict. And the conflict a lot of the time was between the Hellenists and the Jews there. But it was a center of wealth, so people continue to go. All right, so let's talk about Greeks. Yeah, you thought I was done because I said conclusion. It's conclusion for that. So the Greeks outside of the city-state. We just want to consider this a little bit. So during the period from 1100 to 500 BC, Greeks who were not residing in city-states lived in various settings and engaged in different activities. So we start to have the urban society. Then we have some rural society as well. So here's kind of an overview of some of their points, some of what's going on. Rural areas and countryside, villages, and small settlements. So many Greeks lived in small villages scattered across the countryside, and they primarily focused on agriculture. So these communities were often self-sufficient, relying on local resources for their survival. Sparta is unique in that they had their own slave population, and we'll talk about them. But that's who took care of their agriculture, because remember, they are a military oligarchy. They're focused on establishing militaristic society. They don't have time for farming, which they considered to be a lesser activity, and that lesser activity meant that their slave community needed to take care of those, or the helots. Agriculture activities were important, though. Specifically, what they're doing, they're practicing subsistence farming. A lot of that would be their grain, wheat, barley. They're also going to have olives and grapes, being in the Mediterranean. They also raised livestock, including sheep and goats, which provided milk, meat, and wool. Land ownership. Land was a crucial factor in wealth and status. Wealthier families often owned larger tracts of land and employed poorer villagers as laborers. So most of them did it with Sparta as the exception. There are some that are pastoral and nomadic, so they are herding. So that's more in these mountainous regions, less fertile ground, and they'll do what we recognize as a pastoral lifestyle, moving their herds of sheep and goats to find fresh pastures. As you go further north and you get further deeper into Europe, when we move more into the Roman period, what we'll start to see more cattle come into play in that Roman period as they move into the Roman areas of Europe, and even in Britain, as far as Britain and such. Actually, it's funny because the Romans typically had a pretty good fondness for pork, less so much for lamb. But once they get into Europe and Britain, they develop a taste for beef, and that actually becomes a preference for a lot of Romans. I think it was I forget which of the early Roman emperors it was who asked a group of Jews about pork. If they didn't like pork, but they ate lamb. Of course, Jews don't eat pork. And this Roman emperor responds with, "Lamb, I don't like it very much." And so there's this whole dialogue around this Roman emperor not liking lamb. It's not very nice. So he probably had a little too much mutton. So tribal organization. Some pastoral groups were organized into tribes or clans, maintaining strong kinship ties of a shared cultural identity, especially as you get later on into the Greek ideas. So they did colonize areas. Beginning in the 8th century BC, Greeks established colonies across the Mediterranean, Black Sea regions. So they move up over into here, the Black Sea, moving away from their traditional region of Greece, moving out of this location, moving along. We also see the Sea people, of course, leaving this era at about 1000 BC and coming over here and making waves, establishing colonies, and they become the Philistines. So major colonies include Massilia, the Byzantium, Cyrene in North Africa. So these colonies often maintain cultural connections to their mother city-states while developing their own unique local identities. Their cultural and religious life outside the city-state. Greeks living outside the city-state participated in regional religious festivals and rituals. So they gather at sacred sites like Delphi or Olympia, Delphi is an important one. We'll spend a lot of time looking at Delphi in a future lecture. So these gatherings are essential for maintaining cultural identity and religious traditions. They continue to harken back to a lot of their mythology and oral traditions. These rural Greeks transmitted myths, stories, cultural practices, orally preserving their heritage through generation after generation. And it's these epic poems, such as those attributed to Homer, they play a significant role in cultural transmissions. And it's interesting how these epic poems, at various points, they get additions added to them. They get different versions. So Homer may have had different examples of the Iliad and Odyssey that we're aware of. He puts it into his own style, which is brilliant, by the way. If you look at the structure of the poem, just demonstrates the brilliance of the writing style. But I think I mentioned this in a previous lecture, that the Iliad, for example, has alternate endings. Say the Little Iliad is where you get the Trojan horse. That doesn't appear in Homer's ending of this poem. So they have to have all these different versions and additions. So there are trade networks, and they engage in trade with neighboring cultures. They exchange goods. Pottery is a great example of that, and we can follow these trade routes based on ceramic typology or looking at the pottery. They trade textiles. Olive oil becomes an important trade good, as well as wine. Trade routes facilitate cultural exchange and the spread of Greek influence throughout the Mediterranean, which leads to the kind of contact that we were talking about before. As Greeks interacted with non-Greek cultures, such as the Phoenicians, Egyptians, Persians, they adopt various practices and enrich their own cultural and social landscapes. And what we mean by enrich, it really begins to change them because of these influences. So they adopt these other practices. And when they look at other cultures, say the Egyptians, they just look at their gods and say, we all worship the same pantheon. You guys just have different names. So they synchronize those various gods, and they start to take on those practices. Greeks, while they export Hellenism, they also import these other influences. So it'll be interesting when we get to the Persian part to see how much of the Persian identity that they really take on. So, summary. From 1100 to 500 BC, Greeks living outside the city-states led diverse lives in these rural communities, which were pastoral, and also these colonies. They engage in agriculture, they're herding, they're trading, and they have their own religious practices, but they maintain this broader Greek cultural identity, and they export that as they go out. But they have vital connections with these neighboring regions and civilizations. So this period sets the foundation for the eventual rise of Greek city-states as the center of political and cultural life in ancient Greece. So with that, I hope this is helpful for you, and look forward to next week's lecture. If I can be of any assistance, please let me know.